3 men in tactical uniforms were chaining a ranch gate shut when the landowner gave one warning. "Get off my land," he said. The HOA president stepped from a white SUV, smiled, and claimed her patrol now controlled every road and gate in the valley. He asked for badges. She showed plastic cards. He asked for a court order. She laughed. Then one man grabbed his shoulder and reached for his radio, and the landowner recognized the patch, a design he had personally helped build for a real federal protocol. Rebecca Sterling had just turned petty harassment into a felony. It was 6 a.m. when Mason Rourke drove his old pickup truck down the eastern road of Silver Ridge Ranch. Fog still clung low across the grass, thick enough to blur the horizon, and for a moment the world looked exactly the way it had when his father was still alive to see it. From a distance he noticed flashing lights, blue and white, cutting through the mist near his own front gate. A black SUV sat parked sideways, blocking the entrance completely. 3 men in tactical gear were wrapping a heavy new chain around the post, working with the calm efficiency of men who believed they had every right to be there. Across their backs, stitched in bold white letters, were the words Silver Ridge Patrol. Mason stopped his truck about 20 feet away and simply watched for a long moment before doing anything else. He did not shout. He did not immediately reach for his phone. He studied them instead the way he had studied hundreds of uniformed men over the course of a career most people in this valley knew nothing about. Body armor. Radios clipped at the shoulder. Tactical belts loaded with equipment that had no business on a residential road. One man wore a metal name badge, shaped like a star, polished until it caught the early light, and Mason understood immediately what he was looking at. These men were not simply wearing uniforms for visibility. They were dressing to be mistaken for something they were not. He stepped out of the truck and asked the obvious question, the one any landowner would ask. "Who gave you permission to touch my gate?" The man in charge turned around slowly, unbothered, and instead of answering, demanded to see identification of his own, as if the badge on his chest somehow outranked the deed sitting in a filing cabinet 3 miles away. Mason looked at him for several seconds before responding. "You are standing on my land," he said, "and you are asking me for my papers." The man introduced himself only through his tone, calling this a community enforcement operation, a phrase that meant absolutely nothing under any law Mason had ever studied. The man who had grabbed at his radio introduced himself almost proudly as the field commander of the patrol, a title that existed nowhere in any incorporation document, any county contract, or any legal filing Mason would later find. His name, Mason would soon learn, was Travis Boone, and the confidence in his voice suggested he had said that title out loud many times before, always, to people too intimidated to question it. Mason noted the way the other 2 men positioned themselves, one near the front bumper of his truck, one near the rear, a formation designed less for safety and more for control. It was the kind of positioning taught in real law enforcement academies, and seeing it performed by men with expired licenses made something cold settle in Mason's chest. Mason told them to leave. That was warning number 1. The man refused, planting his boots wider, clearly enjoying the resistance. Mason repeated himself calmer the second time, which unsettled the man more than shouting would have. That was when a second vehicle arrived, a white SUV moving fast down the gravel, and a woman stepped out wearing a tailored blazer that looked far too expensive for a dirt road at dawn. She smiled the way people smile when they believe they have already won. Her name was Rebecca Sterling, and she announced without a trace of hesitation that the Homeowners Association had expanded its security jurisdiction to cover the entire eastern corridor of the valley. Mason asked which government body had granted that jurisdiction. Rebecca answered simply that her board had. Mason nearly laughed out loud, but he held it back because something told him this woman was not joking, not even a little. She gestured toward her man to continue locking the gate, and Mason issued his final warning, quiet, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. "Rebecca," he said, "get your people off my land." She looked him straight in the eye and asked almost playfully, "Or what?" That was when the man in charge stepped forward and placed a hand on Mason's shoulder, reaching for his radio, as if to call for backup against an unarmed rancher standing on his own property. Mason looked down at the hand on his shoulder and then up at the patch stitched onto the man's chest, and something in his expression shifted completely. The eagle emblem, the lettering, the spacing of the badge number. It was an unmistakable, almost exact copy of an interagency security identification design, one Mason had personally helped evaluate decades earlier during his years working compliance investigations for federal contractors. He asked very softly who designed this patch. The man only smirked. Rebecca answered, instead proud, certain of herself, telling him her attorney had confirmed the whole operation was completely legal. Mason nodded, once turned back toward his truck, and Rebecca assumed wrongly that she had just watched a man surrender. Before he closed the door, Mason spoke one more time, and his voice carried none of the anger she expected. "Don't change the uniforms," he told her. "I want the investigator to see exactly what I just saw." Rebecca laughed loudly, delighted, certain this was an empty threat from a bitter old rancher who had simply run out of arguments. 14 days later, that exact sentence would be played aloud in front of a grand jury, pulled directly from the recording of her own patrol's body cameras. And by then, Rebecca Sterling would understand exactly how badly she had misjudged the man standing at that gate. To understand how it came to this, it helps to go back 6 months earlier, long before chains and badges and flashing lights. Silver Ridge Ranch stretched across 1,840 acres of Wyoming grassland land that had belonged to the Rourke family for more than 70 years. Mason's father, Walter Rourke, used to say that land did not care who was richer than whom, it only remembered who kept their word. Mason had spent most of his adult life far away from that land, first in Washington and later in Denver, moving between windowless conference rooms and internal investigations most people would never hear about. While he worked, his father grew old alone on the ranch, tending fences and cattle without complaint, never once asking his son to come home sooner. When Walter passed away, Mason found a battered cardboard box tucked into the corner of his father's office, filled with survey maps, deeds, and decades of correspondence about easements and rights of way. Walter had kept everything, every letter, every map, every note scribbled in the margins of old documents, and Mason soon understood exactly why. Just south of the ranch sat Silver Ridge Estates, a gated community of 312 luxury homes governed by a homeowners association under the leadership of Rebecca Sterling. Over 3 years, property values in that development had climbed sharply, driven by clever marketing and an image of exclusivity that Rebecca had built with obsessive precision. There was, however, one persistent problem with Silver Ridge Estates. Only a single main road connected the development to the highway, and during Wyoming winters, that road frequently closed under heavy snow, cutting residents off for days at a time. There was another route, an older service road that cut directly through Mason's property, known locally as the Rourke East Service Road. If the Homeowners Association could secure legal access to that road, the value of every home in Silver Ridge Estates would rise dramatically, potentially by tens of millions of dollars combined. Rebecca had offered to purchase an easement once already, and Mason had refused without hesitation. She raised the offer. He refused again. It was never about the money, not for Mason. Years earlier, his father had made him promise to keep that road private because at the far end of it sat a stretch of native grassland Walter had spent 40 years painstakingly restoring by hand. Rebecca never understood any of that, and truthfully, she never tried to. To her, land was simply an asset waiting to be leveraged, a line item that had not yet been properly monetized. She had built her career in real estate marketing long before taking over the association, and she approached every negotiation the same way she once approached, selling a house with staged smiles, curated language, and a practiced refusal to hear the word no as anything final. To Rebecca, refusal was simply a stage in the process, a temporary obstacle to be managed with enough patience, enough pressure, or enough money placed on the table. 3 months after Mason's second refusal, official letters began arriving from the Homeowners Association, citing landscaping violations, fencing violations, signage violations, an endless stream of minor accusations against a man who was not even a member of that association. Mason read every single letter carefully before placing it into a growing folder labeled simply, Attempted HOA Claims. When his family's longtime attorney Eleanor Graves first reviewed that folder, she pointed out the obvious flaw in Rebecca's strategy. "You are not even part of that association," she said. Mason agreed completely. "Then why keep the letters at all?" Eleanor asked. Mason looked at the growing stack for a long moment before answering. "Because whoever sent them knows that too," he said quietly, and that single sentence would prove to be the first real clue that Rebecca Sterling was not simply harassing a difficult neighbor out of frustration. She was manufacturing a paper trail. Every letter, every violation notice, every polite but pointed piece of correspondence was designed to build a false historical record, one she could later use to argue that the Homeowners Association had exercised long-standing authority over Mason's land. It was a slow, patient, almost bureaucratic form of theft, built letter by letter, month by month, until one day the fiction might simply be mistaken for fact. Mason recognized the pattern almost immediately because he had spent decades studying exactly this kind of quiet, methodical manipulation in his professional life, long before Rebecca Sterling ever knew his name. He began photographing each letter as it arrived, along with the postmark and the exact date it was placed in his mailbox, creating a second independent record, entirely separate from the one Rebecca believed she was building. It was a strange kind of chess match, one where only one player understood that a game was even being played. The Silver Ridge Community Patrol first appeared publicly at the beginning of October, arriving with only 2 SUVs before quickly expanding to 4. Flashing amber lights, body cameras clipped to chest straps, radios crackling with practiced authority, black tactical uniforms that mirrored almost too closely the look of actual law enforcement. Rebecca sent an email to every resident announcing that her new patrol had the authority to stop vehicles, record license plates, perform what she called temporary detentions, and protect something she referred to as community access corridors. That last phrase caught Mason's attention immediately because he had never heard anyone use it before, and he suspected she had invented it specifically to describe